All right, we'll say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of Shirma and Joshua's this year as a zchus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Elul Habalin Tova Ben Goldberg, for Aniyah from the Shemus of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Begar Ezel Bas Zelig Zichron Lebrach, and the hopes that all the tefillos of our Kehila and Klal Yisrael will be answered in the months ahead. Shmoni Libadinovitz Leilu Nishmas David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Harav Yitzchak Aryeh ben Achav, Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need refuah shavin, kol cholei Yisrael, Kodesh Baruch Hu Shirei Meretz Hashem, bring home our hostages, b'shalom and b'karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful, b'chol ma'aseh yedehem, and truly bring shalom to all of Am Yisrael and to Eretz Yisrael. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, really exciting daf ahead of us today with some really just fascinating pieces of information. So today's daf is daf test 9. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Ches Amud Beis, bottom of the daf. Mishnah, Ein chayavan al shmias kol, v'al bitui svasayim, v'al tumas mikdash v'kadasha. So as we already alluded to some of this in yesterday's daf. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, we are dealing essentially now with three unique entities. One of them is the Beis Din. Right, Sanhedrin, Beis Din. Beis Din issues an erroneous ruling. Remember again, that's Helam Davar, then followed by Shigagas Maisa, Klal Yisrael, or some segment acts upon that, Par Helam Davar Min Hatzibor. That's category 1. Category 2, a Nasi, or let's go Kohen Mashiach, right? Kohen Gadol offers an erroneous ruling. Who is he offering the erroneous ruling to? He's not passing on but himself. What's Talacha? He offers up also a par, a unique carbon just from same thing. Helam davar, shigagas maisa, requires an erroneous ruling and then following up an unintentional action based on that ruling. Category 3 is the Nasi, the king. Ultimately, again, if the Nasi goes ahead and delivers a ruling once again, followed by himself, and we'll talk about more about the Nasi today. He has a unique offering, ultimately, again, of a sire. And the same idea, Shigas Maisa, Shigas Helam Davar, Shigas Maisa. So again, we'll say, so that's kind of, now again, we saw actually by the Nasi, there's Machlokes, does it require Shigas Maisa, does it require Helam Davar or not? We're going to talk about that more today. Now the Mishnah is going to talk about some exceptions to this. That there are certain areas of halacha where if these erroneous rulings happen, there is no unique carbon. For example, let's go. Mishnah, Ein Chayavin. So when it says about when we say Ein Chayavin, remember, Ein Chayavin means these individuals are not obligated to bring their unique type of carbon. So Ein Chayavin al Shmias Kol. So ultimately, again, Shmias Kol Bosai is a shvuah. Remember back to our shvuah days that if someone tells you, someone comes over to me, Silber, you know that I lent Ruvain money. Right, and I say, and swear that you don't have any edus for me. Right, I'm not sure I say edus, but and I say I don't. So Shmias Kol means someone else is making a statement. I'm answering in the affirmative, right, and I'm taking a shvuah by answering to someone else. That's what's called Shmias Kol. So I'm not articulating the shvuah myself. Someone else is saying it, but I'm answering. I'm confirming the shvuah. It's as if I've taken the shvuah. So that's what's called Shmias Kol. Ein chayav on Shmias Kol, v'al bitui svasayim. So bitui svasayim, also again, back to our shvuah days, and right, an oath of articulation. Remember again, we'll say that's Shtayim Shein Arba, right? I will eat, I won't eat, I have eaten, I haven't eaten. Again, bitui svasayim, v'al tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Now we saw tumas mikdash v'kadashav yesterday, right? Halacha l'maaseh, anything to do with the halachos of tumah in the Beis HaMikdash, Now remember again, Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav also falls into two categories. Category 1 is about actual Tumah in the Beis HaMikdash itself versus halachos of individuals entering into in the Beis HaMikdash in the state of Tumah. So if the Sanhedrin or the Nasi or the Mashiach delivers halachic rulings regarding any of these areas, there is no unique carbon brought for their erroneous ruling. That's the halacha. Take a look, I will say, at the Mishnah for just a moment. Rashi, the Mishnah, sorry. So Rashi's left-hand column, Ein Beis Din chayav al shmias kol, v'al bitois asayim v'al tumas mikdash v'kadashav, the chol hani Havyon bekarban ola v'yored kidarmina le'el the tzibor ein mevi'in chatas ela bekvuas. So remember, we actually saw this in yesterday's daf. At least we saw the Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. The halach is like this. The common denominator between all of these halachic areas of Shmias Kol, Bitois Vasayim, Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav is that they are subject to what we call a carbon ola v'yored. What's a carbon ola v'yored? It's a type of sin offering that depends on your financial status. If you have more money, then you'll bring a nicer carbon. If you're impoverished, you'll bring a very, very simple carbon. So we already saw in yesterday's daf that anytime you have an infraction that is subject to carbon ola v'yored, the unique carbonos of these individuals or a beis din does not apply. So we saw in yesterday's daf. There was a whole limud there. Because the only time, remember again on both sides. So you have on one hand you have the Sanhedrin, the Kohen Gadol, and the king with all their unique carbonos. On the other hand, if an individual would commit any of these same infractions, what would the yachid bring? A carbon chatos. So anything that a yachid would bring a carbon chatos for, these unique, I'm calling based in individuals, but you understand, these unique entities would bring their specialized carbon for. But it's got to be a chatos. So therefore, any situation where the individual would bring a carbon ola v'yored, which is just a different type of sin offering, just based on a scriptural technicality. It's Xeris HaKasuv. Ultimately, again, these unique entities do not bring their specialized carbon. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. Back to the Mishnah. The Gemara says, and again, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that the Nasi, the king, is treated just like the Sanhedrin and the Beis Din and the Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Kiva says no. Anasi chai b'kula, not true. Rabbi Kiva says in general, Anasi goes ahead and halacha l'maisa. Anasi is chayiv in everything. In other words, Anasi would bring his unique carbon in all of these things. Now, both sides. Now, essentially, the machlokes over here is whether or not a nasi is chayiv in a carbon ola v'yored. We'll see this in the Gemara. So Rabbi Kiva says the nasi is chayiv with everything, chutz mishmias hakol, with the exception ultimately again of shmias kol. So remember again, shmias kol is the case where someone else articulates a shvuah and I affirm that shvuah. A nasi is not obligated in that. Why? This is very interesting because a king in general is not subject to anything of a testimonial nature. Shamelech lo dan v'lo danin also, v'lo meyed v'lo me'idin also. Because we'll say a king in general is not subject to any testimonial law, right? A king cannot be a judge, a king cannot be judged, a king cannot testify, and a king cannot be testified about. So therefore, again, shmias kol, which in general, again, is a shvuah about eidos, simply doesn't apply to a king. Okay, incredible. So Amula, so let's analyze. Amula, my time I would say Lili. So remember again, the point of, here's what's interesting. Everyone seems to agree regarding the Sanhedrin and the Kohen Gadol, that halacha l'maisa, they're only going to be subject to their unique karbanos in a case where a yachid would be obligated in a chatos. But where a yachid would be obligated in a carbon ola v'yored, in that case, the Sanhedrin and the Kohen Gadol do not go ahead and bring their unique karbanos. The machlokes case is about the Nasi. What do you do in the case of the Nasi? So the Nasi ultimately says, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Nasi is just like Kohen Gadol and Sanhedrin. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, a Nasi is chayiv even in a carbon ola v'yored. Let's analyze. So Amrullah, my time, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, what's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's logic? Amar Kragas, the pasuk says, V'haya, and we'll say, just by the way, I want to give you this now because I think it's just easier as you operate through. We paskin ultimately again like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So the nice part is that all three of these entities are in the same boat. So therefore, Sanhedrin, Kohen Gadol, and Nasi only bring their unique karbanos when an individual will be subject to a chatas. But if the individual is subject to a carbon ola v'yored, they do not bring their unique karbanos. That is the halacha l'maisa. Okay, so I'm putting the horse before the cart. We just jump the gun a little bit on that. But I think it's helpful just to know that as we go forward. Says the Gemara. So Amrullah, my time to leave. Let's really say leave logic. So the Gemara says Amakra vayaki yashon la'achas be'ila kol shemischayev ba'achas mischay b'kulin. Interestingly enough, the pasuk says, whoever will be culpable for one of these things. Now, both say this pasuk happens to be talking about the items mentioned in the Mishnah. The pasuk itself is talking about liability for shmias kol, bitui sfasayim, and tumas mikdash v'kadoshav. So it's interesting, right? This grouping is not random. This grouping is biblical. It's biblical. So therefore, Rabbi Yosef says, the pasuk says, if someone will be guilty for one of these things, so Rabbi Yosef understands, kosher mischayev ba'achos, mischayev b'kulan. Whoever is liable in one of these cases is liable in all of these cases. V'she'ein mischayev ba'achos, ein mischayev b'kulan. Essentially, Rabbi Yosef's logic is like this. It's a grouping. It's a grouping. And if halacha l'maaseh again, you have liability in one, you have liability in all of them. But if you don't have liability in one, you have liability in none of them. Therefore, again, ve'ema, but why is that? Why don't we say if there's liability in one, be liable for the one that you're liable? Why do you have to need group liability? Rather, Rabbi Yosef Lili's logic is from here. The Sanyo, Rabbi Omer, Ne'emar, top of Tess. Ne'emar lo sagia yado, v'ne'emar lo sasig yado. So I will say this is very interesting. I will say, so the pasuk says lo sagia yado. Now this is talking about over here a carbon oleviorate. Carbon oleviorate, right? So and then it says lo sasig yado. So the Gemara says mi shebali de anios v'ashirus. I will say this is fascinating. Who is an individual who is subject to a carbon oleviorate? This is fascinating. Someone who is capable of reaching poverty, right? Reaching wealth also, but really reaching poverty. In order to, this is fascinating. In order to become chayv carbon oleviorate, you have to have the capacity to become impoverished. Yatsa nasi umashiach shein ba'in lidanios. This comes to exclude a king and a kohen gadol who can never become impoverished. Now, what does that mean? This is fascinating. Nasi, dichsev, v'asa achas mikol mitzas Hashem elokav. Remember again the Nasi, because the pasuk says over here, this is by the unique carbon of the Nasi, right? He went ahead and he violated one of the mitzvos of Hashem, his God. Mi she'ein al gabav el Hashem elokav. Who's the Nasi, Rabbi said? Who's the Nasi? Who's the king? The king is someone who is answerable to no one but God, which means he is the most powerful man in the Jewish people. With power comes money. So therefore, the assumption is the king can never be poor. The king can never reach, he can just never be impoverished. Mashiach, what about the Kohen Gadol? Dichsiv, v'kohen hagadol me'echav, shu gadol me'echav, b'noi, b'koach, b'chachma, b'osher. So this is incredible. When the Torah describes the Kohen Gadol, how does it describe the Kohen Gadol? The Kohen hagadol me'echav. Now, if you look at the Lashon here, it's very interesting. The Kohen who is Gadol, he's greater, me'echav. Now, me'echav could mean than his brothers or from his brothers. What does this mean? I will say, what does it mean? Shu Gadol me'echav, he has to be greater than his brother. B'nai, interesting, the Kohen Gadol has to be handsome. B'koach, physical strength. Chachma, wisdom. And osher, wealth. The Kohen Gadol must possess all of these qualities. Now we're focusing on the wealth over here. Furthermore, Gemara says, so what happens if you have a Kohen Gadol who is handsome, who is strong, who is wise, but he's not wealthy? He's lacking wealth. What do you do in that case? The Gemara says, Tabulomar, va'kohen hagadol me'echav, asher yutzak al rosho, gadlehu me'echav. The other Kohanim are obligated. You put together a Kohen Gadol GoFundMe page, right? And what happens? They are obligated to go ahead and make him wealthy. Make him wealthy. I will say, by the way, it's also interesting that the obligation to make the Kohen Gadol wealthy falls upon the other Kohanim. Right? It's fascinating. It does, like the Gemara doesn't say Klal Yisrael has to make him wealthy. The Kohanim have to make him wealthy. So I will say, so therefore, this is really fascinating. So halacha l'maisa, who's going to be subject to who's a carbon oleviorate? Only someone who has the ability to experience poverty. A king can never experience poverty. He is the king. Kohen Gadol can never experience poverty because by definition, if he's the Kohen Gadol, he's got to be wealthy. We'll say, it's interesting. It's interesting that Klal Yisrael, right? We Klal Yisrael ultimately, again, are compared to two things. We're compared to many things. But in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Va'atem tiyu li mamleches Kohanim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls us Kohanim. I will say, there's a beautiful idea. The Maggid the Mezrich says so beautifully, that the greatest sin that a Jew ever commits, the greatest sin that he could ever commit, is that he forgets that he's a ben melech. He forgets that he's a son of the king. Right? He forgets that ultimately he's royalty. So it's interesting, if you think about it, that we are compared both to Kohanim as well as to kings, as well as to royalty. And I will say, how beautiful is this? What is the feature of being a Kohen and being a king? You are never impoverished. You're never impoverished. And I will say, think about that just on a ruchnius level. What does it mean to be mamleches kohanim? What does it mean to be a kohen gadol? What does it mean to be a melech? It means that no matter what I do in life, I can never become spiritually impoverished. I can make a lot of mistakes. I can make a lot of wrong turns. I could do a lot of things that really mess me up and mess up my life and take things off the rails. But at the end of the day, I'm never impoverished. At the end of the day, the personalistic spiritual coffers are never empty. There's always something in the tank. There's always something in the soul. And that should give us the chizuk, especially during this season. Because a lot of times we come to Yom Naram and we put on a good face, but I'm so down on myself. I'm so disappointed in myself. I'm so disillusioned with myself that I don't even feel there's somewhere to get started. Well, just remember, you're a Kohen Gadol. Just remember that you're a melech. And both of those individuals never taste impoverishment, right? There's always something there. There's always internal wealth. No matter how badly we've messed up, we always have the ability and the spiritual credit to be able to affect a turnaround. So incredible. Well, say this is a fascinating case. What happens if the king gets tzara? So now, here's what we've established. So just so you appreciate the circle over here, right? What have we established? That at least the king and the Nasi and the Kohen Gadol don't bring a carbon old levi, right? Why don't they bring a carbon old levi? Because to bring a carbon levi, you have to be able to experience poverty. These individuals can't experience poverty. Now, remember again, let's go full circle. That's why the Mishnah said they're not subject to their unique karbanos when it comes to these cases in the Mishnah. Shmias kol, bituis vasayim, tumas mikdash v'kadashav, because those are averos for which the liability is carbon ola v'yored. So therefore, they're not subject to this. Now the Gemara asks an interesting follow-up question. What happens if the king gets saras? Now what does that mean? Now again, halacha l'maisa, if the king gets saras, he can't be king. Rashi points out over here, Nasi shenitztara l'Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yosef Lili, da'avra minisiyaso she'ein roy liyos melech kishum mitzora. Kedamin l'kavan perak beis v'ayinaga shemes hamelech v'ayim mitzora ad yom oso. So apparently, again, we're going to learn this concept tomorrow's daf. Apparently, right? That halacha l'maisa, if a king contracts tsaras, he cannot be king. He cannot be king. In other words, he can't be king while he has tsaras. It doesn't mean he can't go ahead and resume the throne, which is really fascinating. Right? You can't act as the king, which makes sense, right? Why does it make sense? Why are you getting tsaras? Why are you getting tsaras? Because you did something. You did something. So you can't go ahead and be the leader of the people if you yourself are not modeling the right kind of behavior. So therefore, if the king has saras, he's got to abdicate the throne during that time. So here's what's interesting. So Yachid Shenistara Mahu. What is the halacha? Now, what does this mean? What does this mean? Now, halacha, what the Gemara is asking is like this. We just established that the king can't bring a carbon old levi because he can't go ahead and get to the level of poverty. Well, what happens if he's not king? What happens if he was forced to at least temporarily abdicate the throne? Is he subject to a carbon old levi during this time of saras? So the Gemara says, Ma'u, mitchadachi. Do we say ultimately again, mitchadachi means, do we say that halacha l'maisa? Listen, essentially, once you're king, you are forever removed from the parsha of carbon old levi. And even if halacha l'maisa, right now you're not functioning as king, you're still removed from the parasha, or miftar pater. Or no, what it means is when you're king, you're pater. But if you're not the acting king, then you're going to be chayiv. It's interesting, the Gemara says, Amalei. So he responded, Tilach o de Gaza. Tell me, is the king paying for this from his money or from your money? Right? So what does this mean, the Gemara says? So what it's saying is like this. Essentially, one of the advantages of being king is not, okay, obviously king comes with power, but king also comes with opportunities for personal financial advancement. And I will say, it's fascinating. the notion of public office as a tool for personal enrichment is not something that modern day politicians discovered, right? In other words, this was always, and by the way, I also want to point out, lav dafka, that it's something nefarious. Like, in other words, sometimes just based on positions that you have, open up additional opportunities for you. That, again, not anything illegal or bad. Obviously, the person has to be careful with it. But Lamaisa, so the Gemara is just saying over here, the king's wealthy. The king's wealthy. He's going to be wealthy because he's king, and his own personal finances have generated a tremendous amount of wealth also. So just because he's not acting a king, the fact that he was king obviously has most probably endowed him with tremendous personal wealth, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, he is always pater from carbon ola v'yored. Incredible. Tanya B'Kiva Omer, Mashiach pater mikulan. Ultimately, again, the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol ultimately is pater from all of these things. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Tanya B'Kiva Omer, Mashiach pater mikulan, right hand side. Mi carbon ola v'yored. Yechsev zeh carbon aron ubanav yom meshach also. Asir seifa dahinu chavite Kohen Mashiach. The chavitin ba'al l'chova ve'in acheres ba'al lo. The asir seifa ola v'yored lo ba'al l'chova. So, both say, interesting. The Gemara says, so Rabbi Kiva says, anytime there's a carbon ola v'yored, the Kohen Gadol is going to be pater. So the Gemara says, Amar my time Rabbi Kiva. What's Rabbi Kiva's logic? The Amar Kra. And I just want to point out, when we say, I said this yesterday, but I feel like I should say it again. When we say pater, remember, obviously you're talking about situations where someone committed an avera. So there's liability whenever you commit an avera. Pater over here is used in a very strict legal sense to be discussing a particular carbonic liability. So therefore, a Kohen Gadol is pater from carbon ola v'yored. Okay, so what's the pasuk? Amakra, that carbon Aaron above. So this is the carbon ultimately of Aaron and his sons. I must say this is referring to the Chavite Kohen Gadol, right? This is referring to the unique carbon of the Kohen Gadol. Zu ba'achova, lo ve'in acheres ba'achova. This is this Kohen Gadol carbon. This is the one that is obligatory upon him. The other ones are not. So maybe the Gemara will say, maybe in the world of Ola v'yored, maybe the Kohen Gadol is simply exempt from the lowest tier carbon. What is that? Umayniyu, the Gemara says, what is that? Asir sa'ifa. That's what I'll say, literally again, like the lowest level meal offering. Avalanios v'ashiris lo mi'ater rachmana. But maybe higher levels of Ola v'yored, perhaps the Kohen Gadol should be chayiv in. This is the one who could achieve atonement from any one of these achieves atonement through all of them. So we'll say, so essentially, again, the only time you're going to be chayiv in Ola v'yored is if you be chayiv to any of the extreme forms of the carbon. But again, once you're not being subject once you're not subject to poverty, by definition, ultimately, again, you're not subject to the lowest level. If you're not subject to the lowest level, you're not chayiv in any of them. El me'ata d'chsev v'haya kiyesh am la'achas me'ela. So you can make the same drasha over here by this passage, right? So maybe once again, only if you have liability for the whole group, then you have liability for any one of them. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, why does it say Rabbi Kiva Omer? Rabbi Kiva says, Nasi chayiv chutz mishmias kol. Remember, it's not true. Rabbi Akiva says that ultimately, again, a nasi does have liability in tumas mikdash v'kadashav, does have liability in bitui sfasayim, only is exempt in shmias kol. So you see, that's not treated as a group. Abai, the Gemara says, Abai v'rav damit Abayu me'achos mashmalei la'achos lo mashmalei. He darshans me'achos. He doesn't darshan le'achos. Umayshna me'achos demashma. Why does he darshan me'achos? Because the Torah Dafka writes this at the end by Asira Seifa, which is the lowest level Ola v'yored. To teach you that only if you're chayiv in the lowest level, or you could be subject to the lowest level, or Ola v'yored, will you be chayiv in everything. Because if you would think that even if you're not subject to one of the levels of Ola v'yored, you should still be subject to the other ones. If that's the case, then write that pasuk again by dalus, by the lowest level carbon, inami ba'ashiros, or by the highest level of ashiros. The fact that it doesn't write it by one of the poles, but ultimately kind of writes it in the middle, indicates to us The only time you're going to be chayv in carbon olav yored is if you could be subject to all shades of olav yored. But if someone is never subject to poverty, and therefore again never brings the lowest level olav yored, therefore they're not subject to any. Incredible. Again, Rabosai, bottom line, takeaway message over here. Halacha l'maisa again, Kohen Gadol, and we paskin as well. Nasi, king, are not subject to carbon olav yored. Again, Sanhedrin goes without saying they're not subject to carbon olav yored. We saw that already in yesterday's daf. So because they're not subject to olav yored, therefore halacha l'maisa, they will not bring their unique karbanos in these aforementioned cases of shmias kol, bitoy svasayim, tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Or to state it a little bit differently as a definitive rule, the only time Sanhedrin, Kohen Gadol, king, bring their unique offering for erroneous ruling is in a case where the individual would be subject to a karban chatos. That's it. If the individual is subject to a different karban, they're not, quote unquote, their pater. They're not bringing their unique karbanos. Incredible. Mishnah. Kala mitzvah shevatorah shechayav and azdon and kares ashegas and chatas. Suppose say here it is hayochid maybe kispo seira. Suppose this is actually interesting Mishnah of general halachos regarding karbanos. Any mitzvah, any avera really, an avera in the Torah that ultimately, again, if performed intentionally, would carry with it a punishment of kares. And ultimately, again, an unintentional violation would bring a carbon chatas. So again, I will say when the individual brings his chatas, what is the chatas? Hayachin maybe kispa usiira. So ultimately, again, the individual will bring a sheep or a goat. That's a chatas, a sheep or a goat. Good. Rule one. In that same case, hanasi seir. If the king went ahead and issued an erroneous ruling, and then followed through on it, the king would bring a seir. That's the king's unique offering. Mashiach or Bezdin. Ultimately, again, Kohen Gadol, Bezdin, they issued an erroneous ruling and people followed through on it. They bring their par. So we'll say that's the paradigmatic case, right? That's the paradigm that we've been operating with this entire Masechta. Next, what about in the case of, bless you, what about the case of Avodah Zarah? Hayochid v'hanasi v'mashiach mevi'in sira. So in the case of Avodah Zarah, ultimately again, the individual, the nasi, and the Kohen Gadol all bring a seir. Ubezdin par v'soyer. Bezdin bring a par and a soyer. Okay, really, right? They brings a par and a soyer. Par the ola, usir lechatos. A par for an ola and a seir ultimately for a chatos. Asham taloi. What about Asham taloi case? Well, this is a really great mishnah because this is like a compilation of the halachos of karbanos. Asham taloi. That's a sin offering. That is depends on your financial status. Hayochid v'nasi chayavin. I will say, I just want to point out something amazing, just like the hashkafa of an asham taloi. Say, think to yourself, I don't know, it seems insensitive. Why not go ahead and just say, what, everyone brings the same carbon. Right? After all, why make people feel this one has more, this one has less? Say, do you know one of the most important yisodos in Yiddishkeit? I don't know if it's one of the most important yisodos. It's an important yisod. Is you have to understand in life, some people have more and some people have less. Sometimes we become so preoccupied with people's feelings that we put feelings above reality. And we feel like we have to coddle everyone. Everyone has to be coddled. And no, chas v'shalom, you should never be aware that someone has more than you. Yeah, there are people who have more than me. People have more than me, people have less than me, and that's just the way the world works. It's the same way, by the way, that in life, there are winners and there are losers, right? And that's the way life works. And that's why when, we give every single child a trophy, and suddenly again, there's first through 172nd place and everybody gets a ribbon, right? It's profoundly detrimental chinuch, because it's important for children to understand ultimately again that there are winners, there are losers. Just like I will say, sometimes, even efforts sometimes to regulate the types of simchas that people make. Yeah, we should all be moderate in what it is that we do. But this notion that, this one's going to have this, there are people who have more, there are people who have less. There are people that make bigger simchas, people that make smaller simchas, people that take nicer vacations, people that take lesser vacations. And again, so much of life is just being comfortable in your own skin. Even if you can't do what everyone else is doing, it's okay. It's okay. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving me exactly what I need. Maybe I'll work hard. I'll try to have more. But even if I can't, I'm good. I'm good. I always thought like the hashkaf of Asham Taloi is, yeah, you know what? Ruvain has more money than I do. So he's going to bring a nicer carbon. I have lesser money. Doesn't make me a lesser person. And so much of my life is trying to be Ezuhu Ashir Hasamech Bechalkos. The Gemara goes back to Asham Taloi. What happens with Asham Taloi? So the Gemara says, Hayachid v'hanasi chayavin. Ultimately, again, Asham and Asham Taloi. So the Yachid individual and the Nasi are both chayiv in that. Interestingly enough, machlokis with our previous. That's the machlokis in our previous Mishnah. Umashiach ubezdin p'turin. But ultimately, again, the Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol, and the Bezdin are pater. Asham Vadai. What about an Asham Vadai? Hayachid v'hanasi v'Mashiach hayavin. Everyone is chayiv in an Asham Vadai. Ubezdin p'turin. But Bezdin does not bring that. Ashmias hakol v'abitui sasai v'atumas mikdash v'kadashav. Shabbos say, so again, hearkening back to the last Mishnah, right? Shmias kol. So again, someone makes a shvua, I affirm it. Bitui sasayim, a shvua of articulation. Tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Issues of tuma either in the mikdash or individuals entering into the mikdash. Bezdin p'turin, which means again, if Bezdin issued a ruling regarding any of these things, ultimately, they're pater. Va'yochid va'nasi v'mashiach chayavin. And ultimately, again, yochid, nasi, mashiach are chayiv. Ella she'ein kohen gadol mashiach chayiv al tumas mikdash v'kadashav di Rabbi Shimon. But ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon says that the kohen gadol is not chayiv for any rulings rendered on tumas mikdash v'kadashav. The Gemara says, Umay mevi'in. What carbon do they bring? So the Gemara says, carbon olavi oreid Rabbi Lazar Omer Hanasi maybe soyer. Okay, incredible. So this is a really nice Mishnah that has a little bit of like a catch-all of all the information we're dealing with up until now. So Tanya, Rabbi Shimon says as follows: Rabbi Shimon Hayanos Klal Kol Shayachib Asham Talui Hanasi Kiyotzebo. Right, Rabbi Shimon used to give the following principle: anytime an individual is chayv in an Asham Talui, the Nasi will also be chayiv. Kiyonasi kiyosebo. Mashiach ubeizim p'turin. And Mashiach means will be pater. That's pretty much in line with what we said in the previous. So again, with the exception of Nasi. The choshu ba'asham vadai. Anytime an individual is chayiv in an Asham vadai, Nasi u'Mashiach u'kiyotzebo. I'm sorry. Choshu Asham vadai. Anytime an individual is chayiv in an Asham vadai, so Nasi Mashiach kiyosebo. And the Nasi Mashiach will be the same thing. Ubeizim p'turin. Beizim will be pater. Shmias hakol u'bitu isvasayim v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Those cases we just mentioned before. What's the halacha? Bezdin p'turin. Bezdin is pater. Nasi u'Mashiach chayavin. And Nasi Mashiach will be chayiv. Ella shein hanasi chayiv b'shmias hakol. Nasi is not chayiv in shmias kol, as you spoke about before. Why not? Because remember again, that's a matter of testimony, and the king has nothing to do with testimony. But lo Mashiach b'tumas mikdash v'kadashav, and a kohen gadol doesn't have liability regarding matters of tumah in the Beis Hamikdash. V'chol shu ba'olav yored. Anytime the subject to olav yored, nasi kiyotebo. Right. So if the individual is chayv in olav yored, nasi shares the same halacha. Mashiach ubeizin p'turin, and Mashiach beizin apater. I says, you know, a second. Hagufa kashya. It's a contradiction. You said before that a kohen Mashiach is not chayiv in Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav. The Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav for the pater. Aval b'shmias hakol u'bitu esasayim chayiv. And both remember again, these things are normally considered to be a group. So what you're making it sound like is Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav. The nasi is pater, but the other parts of the group, namely shmias kol bitu esasayim, the nasi will be chayiv. Whoa, 1 second. Ema seifa. Koshu ba'olav yored nasi kiyotzebo Mashiach ubezdin p'turin. Katani Mashiach ubezdin p'turin. And we say ma bezdin p'tur mikulu, just like the bezdin is pater in all of these cases, namely again shmias kol bitu esasayim tumas mikdash v'kadashav af Mashiach p'tur mikulu. So to the kohen gadol should be pater from everything. So you contradicted what you just said before you said it was liability. So Gemara said, "I'm a beis kashina dadi contradiction." No, it's not a contradiction. Kan bedalus, kan bedali dalus is talking about two different cases. One is talking about the lowest level of carbon olav yored, and one is talking about, again, not the lowest level. Look at Rashi, dali dalus. Dali dalus means like literally, again, the impoverished of the impoverished. So Rashi says over here, Mashiach pater mikulu ki dichsiv zeh carbon aron she'ein acheres ba'al choba. V'hayit the Mashiach chayiv b'shmias kol bitu esasayim kigom bedalus B'tar B'nei Yona. So Boss says this is very interesting. According to this approach now, the Gemara is suggesting that halacha l'maisa, when we exempt the Kohen Gadol, he is exempted ultimately again from the lowest level carbon olav, but may be subject to certain higher levels of carbon olav. So this is an interesting new sheet over here, because beforehand we assumed either you're chayiv in carbon olav or you're patur from carbon olav. So here there might be a hybrid model where maybe you're chayiv in certain parts of olav or certain levels, but not subject to others. Interesting. Rabbi Shimon Sarvalak Rabbi Kiva b'chado palak b'chado. So Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Kiva in one case and argues in one case. Sarvalak Rabbi Kiva b'dalei dalus the pater or palak alei b'dalus. He agrees with Rabbi Akiva that ultimately again he is pater in the lowest level of olav yorei, but argues on him in the higher levels. Whereas Rabbi Akiva ultimately says that he will be subject. Ultimately, Rabbi Shimon says that no, a Kohen Gadol is totally exempt from a carbon olav yorei. Incredible. Ela she'in Kohen Gadol chayiv. Amr Chizkiah. My time with Rabbi Shimon. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? That a Kohen Gadol isn't chayiv. What's his logic? T'chsiv v'nichrasa nefesh shahim mitoch hakal. The pasuk says this individual will be cut off from the kal. Mishe karbano shavalakal. This refers ultimately again to someone whose carbon is the same as the kal's carbon. It comes to exclude one whose carbon is not like the rest of the kal. Ultimately, again, I will say, who is that? That's the Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol. Im kain nasi nami ein carbon shavalakal. But 1 second, but the nasi also, right? The king also has a different carbon than the kal. So the Gemara says. Right, so we'll say some. Sorry, just to be clear. So remember, the Gemara is talking about over here. The Gemara is talking about over here that halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Shimon says that a Kohen Gadol is not chayiv in tumas mikdash v'kadash. I'm sorry, so that's what we're focusing on over here. So now again, let's go back for just a second. So my time with Rabbi Shimon. Why does Rabbi Shimon say that halacha l'maisa Kohen Gadol is not subject to tumas mikdash v'kadash? Because the pasuk says v'nichrasa nefesh mitoch hakal. By tumas mikdash v'kadash, it says that ultimately, again, for infractions of tum in the Beis Hamikdash, there's kares. What are we dashing from here? Mishe karbano shavalakal. Who's liable for this? Someone whose carbon is the same as everyone else's carbon. Yotze zeh she'ein karbano shavalakal. This comes to exclude ultimately, again, someone whose carbon is not like the kal. Now, Rashi understands this to mean that it's talking about someone who is atoned for together with the kal. But Parsha Pshat is someone who has the same carbon as the kal. MK nasi nami ein carbon shavalakal. If that's the case, the nasi should also be excluded because the nasi's carbon is not like the tzibor's carbon. To which the Gemara says, Shava v'kaparas Yomi Kippurim. Well, at least the nasi is the same as Klal Yisrael. Why? It's very interesting because the nasi is included with the general atonement of Klal Yisrael on Yom Kippur. So in that respect, there is some carbonic symmetry between the Nasi and the rest of Klal Yisrael. He is at least included ultimately again in the carbon of Klal Yisrael, in the kapara of Klal Yisrael. To which the Gemara says, Im kein kohanim nami lo shavalakal bekapara Yom Kippurim. The Gemara says, kohanim shavalakal b'shar mitzvahs tishana. Kula. So if that's the case, 1 second. Here's the issue. The kohanim ultimately are not the same as the kal by kapara of Yom Kippur. Because remember again, Kohanim have their own kapara by Yom Kippur. It's true, but Kohanim shavalakal b'shar mitzvos deshana kula. Kohanim at least are the same as Klal Yisrael because they are the same in terms of other forms of atonement throughout the year. Mashiach nami har shava b'shar mitzvos deshana. While again, the Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol, ultimately is also just like Klal Yisrael other mitzvos throughout the year. Ela amarava emahachi. Say the following: Mishachataso shavali yechidim. Ultimately, again, who does it refer to? Someone whose chataso, his sin, is ultimately the same as individuals. Umaynihu, and who is that? The kal. So essentially, again, I will say, who is going to be subject to tumas mikdash v'kadashav? Only someone who shares the same chatas liability as the kal. Ultimately, again, therefore, the Kohen who does not is therefore going to be parted from tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Okay, incredible. Rabbi Lazar Omer Nasi may be seer. So I'll say, so again, Rabbi Lazar says that the Nasi brings a seer. Rabbi Yochanan do Omer Rabbi Lazar Ella betumas mikdash v'kadashav. Ultimately, Rabbi Lazar's shita was only stated regarding tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Why? Hoil v'ne'emar kares bo. Because ultimately, again, since kares is mentioned there, is treated like a chatas kavua ultimately not like a carbon olive yorei. Therefore, there will be liability. It seems to be clear. These are like the Rabbi Lazar Kulin Kamar, because if you think the Rabbi Lazar is talking about everything, if he's referring to all of the cases, so the Gemara says, Michti Seir Nasi. Upar Mashiach b'makom yochid lechatas kai. Because again, if you think about this in just a moment, the seer of the Nasi, right, and the par of the Mashiach are the equivalent, ultimately, again, of the chatas of the individual. Nisni nami, Mashiach may be par b'shmias kol bituis vasayim. So say that the same way that the individual will bring his carbon, the Mashiach will bring a par by shmias kol bituis vasayim. Elo midalo katoni Mashiach. From the fact that it doesn't make any mention of the Kohen Gadol, what do you see from here? Shmamina atumas mikdash v'kadashav koi the Mashiach pater. It must be talking about tumas mikdash v'kadashav, from which, as we said before, ultimately again the Kohen Mashiach is going to be pater, because again about says coming all over your raid. Amrli Rav Huna Breid Rav Nasa Rav Papa. Mimai. How do you know this? Dilma Rabbi Lazar Kulin Kai. Maybe Rabbi Lazar is talking about all of the cases. Over Mashiach from the Rabbi Akiva. And by Kohen Gadol, he holds like Rabbi Akiva, namely what? The Amar, Mashiach Pater Bekulan, who holds that the Kohen Gadol is Pater in all of these cases. Amar Rabbi Akiva, mi Pater le mi par. 1 second, even though Rabbi Akiva says you're Pater, does Rabbi Akiva Pater from the par? Of course not, and therefore Vasulo Midi. There's nothing more to discuss about this. Rabbi Yochanan, Mod Rabbi Lazar, She'ein maybe Asham. Rabbi Lazar agrees that Halacha L'Maisa, since a Nasi ultimately again doesn't bring, right? He agrees that a Nasi does not bring an Asham Taloi for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav. So Tana Kamed Rav Sheshes, Asham Taloi, Bal Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav, you bring in Asham Taloi for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav, Amalei Damar L'Chav money. So whose opinion is that? Rabbi Lazar, the Amar, Hoil V'Ne'emar Bokaris B'Kavua, Maisi Nasir Seir Aleha. Since ultimately, again, Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav has a din of kares, even though, again, the punishment is a carbon olav yored, but we treat it as something that has a chatas kavua. Because it would be treated as a chatas kavua, therefore what? Therefore the Nasi should be chayiv. The Nasi should be chayiv. Ultimately, again, the Amar Hoil V'Ne'emar Bokaris Kavua, Maisi Nasi Seir Aleha. But 1 second, we just said before, Rabbi Lazar agrees that he does not bring an Asham Taloi, to which the Gemara says, Kashya. You're right, it's a contradiction. We're not sure what to do with that. Incredible, Rabbi say. So again, takeaways, right? Takeaways. So Rabbi say, number one takeaway is there is nothing more beautiful than learning Torah Lishma, right? That is the most important takeaway. Both say, just understand what has happened over here. Just understand. Your mind may be a complete blank slate, but just understand that your neshama has just spent 40 minutes learning all about karbanos, which means that for the last 40 minutes, my neshama was residing within the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. So if you feel a ridiculous, overwhelming sense of internal simcha, and you do not know where that is coming from, that's because for the last 40 minutes, your neshama was inside the Beis HaMikdash, even though your mind was counting ceiling tiles. Right? But again, I will say, again, it's okay. It's okay. But remember that's what this is. That's all what this is. Just like I was saying, you know how sometimes you may be sitting with someone who you love very much and you're in a conversation, and then when the conversation is over, perhaps you have no idea what the conversation was about. That may or may not happen, right? You have no idea what the conversation was about. But you know what? It still feels so good because I was sitting with someone who I love very much. And the neshama knows that the relationship just became so much stronger. Rabbi say, that's what happened over the course of our last few minutes. And I will say, but again, in all seriousness, keep our principles. Our principles, Rabbi say, at least if we emerge now. And by the way, tomorrow, coming attractions, some beautiful agarata, some great halacha. But Rabbi say, but remember again, I'm actually going to see, I'm going to try to, there must be also like a table that tableizes all of these halachas. But again, Rabbi say, remember, pieces of information that we emerged from today, individual, right? Whenever an individual brings a chatos, halacha l'maaseh, that is when the nasi the Sanhedrin and the Kohen Gadol are bringing their unique karbanos. If the individual is bringing an Asham Talui, ultimately, again, they are exempt from their unique karbanos. That's pretty much everything today in a nutshell. Again, only machlokes is a nasi subject to karban olev yored. That's a fundamental machlokes. Rabbi say, Hadrun alach, hore koy Mashiach. Shkach Rabbi say, Mazel Tov, we continue the journey tomorrow. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.
I know Rashi says years ago, they're required to make him rich.
V'hakohen hagadol me'echa.
We said maybe that's Klal Yisrael. Attend to you.
No, because no. Because the lashon of me'echa v'hakohen is used a number of times in the context of Kohanim. That phrase of echav is distinctly Kohanim. It's used in other places.
In that context, in the context
of the family of Kohanim. Yeah.
Like the kapara for Yom Kippur, like
correct. I don't remember the psukim.